I'm Nima Rajan. Canada has installed its 30th Governor General today in Ottawa. Mary Simon's swearing-in ceremony was scaled back due to the pandemic. The number of attendees to the Senate ceremony was limited. Public health rules required everyone to wear masks and be physically distant. The ceremony included traditional Inuit elements as Her Excellency becomes the country's first Indigenous Governor General. The federal government is expecting about 5 million doses of COVID-19 vaccine this week, enough to fully inoculate all eligible Canadians. This week's shipment will bring the total number of doses received up to 68 million. Officials say that will be enough to administer 2 doses to all 33.2 million Canadians aged 12 and over. As of Friday, over 57% of Canadians 12 and up had been fully vaccinated, and 79.66% had received at least 1 dose. It appears the pandemic has changed the way most Canadians think about their future with long-term care homes. A survey from the Angus Reid Institute found more than 80% of respondents said their views have changed since COVID-19 hit. About half of those surveyed said they now dread the thought of themselves or their loved ones being in long-term care. 3/4 of respondents said significant changes, if not a complete overhaul, need to happen. And the same number also said they would support making long-term care a fully integrated part of the public health system. Long-term care residents have accounted for the majority of COVID deaths in Canada. Pediatricians are warning parents that there could be a spike in respiratory illness amongst children this summer. Dr. Pascal Lavoie, one of several medical experts to co-author a letter in the Canadian Medical Association Journal, says a respiratory syncytial virus is one of the most common cold viruses that circulate widely in adults and children in winter. Since COVID-19 precautions like social distancing, masking, and hand washing contributed to an abnormally quiet 2020 flu season, there is growing concern that Canada could see a rise in RSV reported in the coming months among previously unexposed infants and young children. A strike is underway by 900 Rio Tinto workers at the mining company's aluminum smelting facilities in Kidnappings, BC. The union had issued a 72-hour strike notice after nearly 7 weeks of negotiations and bargaining continued right up until the early Sunday strike deadline. Unifor National President Jerry Dias says the walkout is about what he calls Rio Tinto's greed and lack of respect for union members. The company said earlier that it was committed to working with the union to reach a mutually beneficial outcome. Well, meanwhile, the union representing Bombardier and de Havilland aerospace workers in Toronto are threatening to hit the picket lines this week unless negotiations can guarantee Dash 8 turboprop-up jobs remain in the area when production resumes. After a 3-week cooling-off period, separate talks were set to restart today ahead of a Tuesday strike deadline. Unifor National President Jerry Dias says the negotiations are about protecting highly skilled advanced manufacturing jobs. The talks come as the aviation sector is taking steps to recover from the pandemic shutdown. The HMCS Fredericton has departed from Halifax on a 6-month deployment for the first time since a helicopter claimed the lives of 6 of its crew members last year. The Royal Canadian Navy frigate left Halifax on Saturday to be a part of NATO's Operation Reassurance. The vessel's deployment last year was rocked when its Cyclone helicopter crashed into the Ionian Sea off the coast of Greece in April. The crash caused the worst single-day loss of life for the Canadian Armed Forces since 6 soldiers were killed in a roadside bombing in Afghanistan in 2007. Former CanTrust leaders are scheduled to make their first court appearance in Toronto today. Court dates for the 3 executives come roughly 3 years after the cannabis company became embroiled in unlicensed growing allegations. Former Chief Executive Peter Aceto, former Vice Chairman Mark Litwin, and former Chairman Eric Paul each face charges of fraud, making false or misleading statements to the OSC, and authorizing, permitting, or acquiescing in the commission of an offense. The Canadian Food Inspection Agency is recalling a cheese product that was distributed across Atlantic Canada, Ontario, and Quebec. The agency says it's recalling Cahill's brand Original Irish Porter cheese due to a possible listeria contamination. Consumers should not eat the products. Instead, the agency says the items should be thrown out or returned to their store of purchase. Canada has its first gold medal in Tokyo. Swimmer Maggie McNeil struck Olympic gold this morning by finishing first in the women's 100-meter butterfly in a time of 55.59 seconds. The 21-year-old from London, Ontario, became Canada's first multi-medalist at the Tokyo Games, following a silver medal in the women's 4x100 freestyle relay on Sunday. All right, stay tuned. Up next, we take a look at new guidelines released by the Chinese Communist Party that experts say indicate insecurities within the CCP. We'll have an interview with Mr. Craig Singleton, China expert, coming up after the break. So stay tuned. We'll be right back, everyone. The Chinese Communist Party has introduced new guidelines on ideological and political work. The changes affect both party members and citizens. These new requirements add to China's already strict guidelines around academic and press freedoms. Meanwhile, a China expert says the Chinese Communist Party's new loyalty push exposes leader Xi Jinping's insecurities. Well, joining us now to tell us more on this is Mr. Craig Singleton, Adjunct Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Sir, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Thanks, Nima.
So can you tell us about the CCP's new set of guidelines that were recently introduced?
Absolutely. So within days of Xi Jinping's fiery July 1st speech marking the Chinese Communist Party's centennial, the party issued new guidelines regarding its ideological and political work, and one that targets not only CCP members, but all of Chinese society. And the goal of these new guidelines is relatively simple and straightforward: ensure absolute loyalty to Xi and to the party. And that includes enhancing the Chinese public's sense of political, ideological, theoretical, and emotional identification with what is often referred to as Xi thought, or the political doctrine that Xi enshrined into the Chinese Communist Party constitution.
And how do these guidelines differ from the other rules introduced by Xi Jinping's government, such as the national security law in 2020?
These new guidelines go even farther than the party's previous indoctrination efforts. Since assuming office in 2012, Xi has waged an intensely ideological campaign aimed at stifling academic and press freedom, all the while orientating China around an aggressive form of nationalism. These efforts also included neutralizing any and all forms of dissent. And yet these latest guidelines make clear that Xi and the party remain deeply concerned about the durability of the party's ideological dominion over the country.
Now, this month was the CCP's 100th anniversary. We saw President Xi boasting about his party's work in bringing up China's economic recovery. So how can all of this speak towards the party's insecurities, as you mentioned in your recent column?
So to remain in power, Xi and the party must deliver on their promise of high-quality growth and shared prosperity, all the while taking into account that the drivers of the last decade's growth are quickly running out of steam. To make matters worse, the United States and other countries around the world have begun to more aggressively confront China's non-market practices, including rampant intellectual property theft and forced technology transfer for companies that are operating inside China. Such practices sit at the heart of China's economic growth. Thus far, Xi has not fully explained how he intends to maintain China's economic growth in the face of all of these new threats. And it's that uncertainty that's going to place a lot of pressure on the Chinese Communist Party in years to come.
So can you paint us a picture on how these new guidelines can impact Chinese citizens as the party continues to try to maintain control within the country?
It remains to be seen how these specific new guidelines are going to play out over the long term. That said, it's clear that the party is willing to pull out all the stops in preparation for next year's 20th Party Congress. And that's when Xi will, in theory, assume a once unprecedented third term. And so in the interim, I suspect the Chinese government will have little tolerance for any internal dissent, whether it be on the ground or on Chinese social media.
Now, we've got a little over 2 minutes left, sir, but considering the CCP government's efforts to maintain control and grow control within China, can all of this be comparable to the operations inside North Korea, considering that these two countries are also close allies?
There are some similarities in terms of ideology and indoctrination, although both countries are really quite different from one another. What is relevant, I think, is that in both cases, policymakers here in the United States and Canada and other countries are ultimately attempting to influence a decider of one, and that's either Xi Jinping or Kim Jong-un.
All right, sir, just about a minute left, but what kind of steps should world leaders take to respond to these new guidelines and alleged human rights abuses within China?
Increased international attention on China's human rights abuses in recent months has definitely caught Beijing's attention. A few months ago, for example, Xi issued new guidance intended to soften Beijing's image, in essence, reining in some of the wolf warrior diplomacy. Those directives did not, however, involve changes to Chinese policies, simply how they are communicated and framed to international observers. That said, I suspect we're unlikely to see any major willingness on the part of the Chinese Communist Party or Xi to discuss human rights in the coming months. What the US and other countries really need to do is stay focused on avoiding miscalculation and really deciding if, when, and how they're going to respond to Chinese provocations.
All right, sir, a quick 30 seconds left, but what's at risk here in terms of international relations and trade with China following these new guidelines?
Sure. I mean, too often the West buys into the Chinese rhetoric, in essence, building China up to be 10 feet tall. The truth could not be farther from that. In many cases, the fiery rhetoric we see from Beijing is intended to mask deep-seated anxiety.
Stay tuned. We'll be right back. The BC Wildfire Service is reporting 259 blazes currently burning in British Columbia. There are now 58 evacuation orders in place, affecting about 4,400 properties, with another 17,500 properties on evacuation alert. An expert says a combination of heat, drought, and drier fuels is causing larger areas to burn in BC. The province has seen over 4,000 square kilometers scorched so far this wildfire season, which is about 4 times the year-to-date averages over both 5 and 10 years. Logging protests continue on southern Vancouver Island's Fairy Creek watershed area. Mounties say protesters breaching an injunction against blockades set up to prevent old-growth logging cut 18 trees with chainsaws and had laid them across a road to block vehicle access. Police add one person was also found to be smoking a cigarette surrounded by tinder-dry forest. 16 people were arrested, including one for allegedly assaulting a police officer, bringing the total number of arrests since May to 494. The Edmonton Firefighters Memorial Society says bronze plaques that contain the names of fallen members have been stolen from the bell tower at Firefighters Memorial Plaza. In a series of tweets, the society says it's concerned that they might be sold for scrap. The group is asking anyone with information to come forward, adding the plaques can be dropped off at any City of Edmonton fire station. Recent numbers revealed by Rajan show that it costs twice as much for the city to remove graffiti in 2020 compared to the previous year. Brent Cranebill with the city says while they can't pinpoint COVID-19 as the driver, they suspect it played a huge role. Mr. Cranebill says either people had too much time on their hands or not as many people were out watching the streets. He says cleanup costs in 2021 are trending back down to a normal rate. Manitoba RCMP are renewing their pleas to the public for any information they might have surrounding the location of missing teen Tammy Nataway. Ms. Nataway was 16 years old when she was last seen in Garden Hill First Nation in northern Manitoba on July 14, 2020. RCMP spokesperson Tara Seal says officers have spoken to more than 100 people, but they still need more information to crack the case. Anyone can provide an anonymous tip online at manitobacrimestoppers.com. A Toronto area police force is mourning the off-duty death of a veteran officer. York Regional Police say Staff Sergeant Craig Heatley, a member of the force for 31 years, died of his injuries from a motorcycle accident on Friday in Meaford. His wife was also involved in the crash and remains in hospital in serious but stable condition. Police Chief Jim McSween shared his grief on Twitter, saying it is a devastating and unexpected loss for all of Craig's family, friends, and platoon mates. Ontario has administered nearly 19 million doses of COVID-19 vaccines. The daily case numbers continue to hold fairly steady, with under 200 new infections a day. The province reported 172 new COVID cases Sunday. No new cases were reported among residents or healthcare workers in long-term care homes. There were 127 people in intensive care units with critical COVID-related illnesses and 81 people on ventilators. Quebecers who have received at least one dose of a COVID-19 vaccine can register to win prizes in the province's vaccine lottery. The government is trying to get 75% of eligible residents fully immunized by the end of next month. Draws for up to $150,000 or a $10,000 scholarship will take place each Friday in August, with the draw for the $1 million grand prize set for September 3rd. The Canadian Red Cross says 2 people have been displaced by a fire that destroyed their home just outside of Antigonish, Nova Scotia. The blaze took place early Saturday evening along South River Road. The organization says the couple has been helped by its volunteers with emergency lodging and financial aid. No injuries were reported. The Nova Scotia Liberals are promising to support federal funding for the province's rural fire departments if they are re-elected next month. Liberal leader Ian Rankin says the funding will come through the Canada Community Building Fund program. Ottawa previously announced Nova Scotia would be receiving $58 million through the program for the 2020 to 2021 fiscal year and a top-up of an additional $55 million. The Nova Scotia election is set for August 17th. One of Nova Scotia's oldest Black communities will be represented by a Black MLA after the general election next month, regardless of which party wins. That's because all 3 declared candidates in the newly reinstated riding of Preston are Black. Liberal candidate Angela Simmons, NDP candidate Coulter Simmons, and Progressive Conservative candidate Archie Beals round out the roster in the riding. It's believed to be the first time in Nova Scotian history that any riding has had a full slate of Black candidates. We'll have top stories from around the world coming up next as China blames the U.S. for stalemate relations and the Russian Prime Minister visits islands claimed by Japan. These stories and more coming up on the Forum Daily. Stay with us. China has blamed the U.S. for what it called a stalemate in bilateral relations as high-level face-to-face talks begin in the Chinese city of Tianjin. A state media report says China's vice foreign minister urged the U.S. to change its highly misguided mindset and dangerous policy. The official Xinhua news agency quoted Xi Feng as telling U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman that the China-U.S. relationship is in a stalemate because some Americans portray China as an imagined enemy. The Russian Prime Minister on Monday visited the Pacific Islands claimed by Japan and said the government is considering setting up a special economic zone there. Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin is touring Russia's Far East and Siberia this week, and the Kuril Islands were his first stop on Monday. Mr. Mishustin said that the government is considering creating a special economic zone on the islands in which business and investors would be free of most taxes and customs duties. A closely watched survey finds that German business confidence has dipped unexpectedly this month. The IFO Institute said Monday that its confidence index declined to 100.8 points in July from 101.7 a month earlier. It was the first decline since January. Economists had expected an increase to 102.5. While managers' assessment of their current situation improved, their outlook for the next 6 months worsened significantly. IFO said this was due to problems with the supply of raw materials and other products and by an upturn in coronavirus infections. China's industry ministry has announced a 6-month campaign to clean up what it says are serious problems within internet apps, violating consumer rights, cybersecurity, and disturbing market order. The Ministry of Industry and Information Technology said in an online notice that companies must fix pop-ups on apps that deceive and mislead users or force them to use services they might not want. The order is part of a wider effort to crack down on tech industries and police use of personal information. Troops have surrounded Tunisia's parliament and blocked its speaker from entering after the president suspended the country's legislature and fired the prime minister. President Kais Saied's decision late Sunday night followed violent nationwide protests over the country's economic troubles and coronavirus crisis. Protesters celebrated the president's actions, but his critics accused him of a power grab that threatens Tunisia's young democracy. The Pakistani military says dozens of Afghan security forces have slipped across the border into Pakistan after their security post was overturned, apparently by the Taliban. Monday's statement says the 46 Afghan forces included 5 officers. There was no immediate response from Kabul and no information about the fighting on the Afghan side of the border. The Taliban have swiftly captured territory in recent weeks in Afghanistan and have seized strategic border crossings with several neighboring countries. Vatican prosecutors have alleged a series of scandals in the biggest criminal trial in the Vatican's modern history. The trial opens on Tuesday in the Vatican museums. A once powerful cardinal and 9 other people are accused of bleeding the Holy See of millions of dollars in donations through bad investments, deals with shady money managers, and apparent favors to friends and family. They face prison sentences and fines if convicted. The trial is the culmination of a 2-year investigation into the Holy See's flawed €350 million London real estate venture. Prosecutors in El Salvador have formally charged former President Salvador Sanchez Serén with illicit enrichment and money laundering. The charges are related to crimes allegedly committed when Mr. Sanchez Serén served as vice president from 2009 to 2014. The case has become known as the public looting scandal. Mr. Sanchez Serén went on to serve as president from 2014 to 2019. He left the country in December and has not returned. France's parliament has approved the law requiring special virus passes for all restaurants and mandating vaccinations for all healthcare workers. Both measures have prompted protests and political tensions. The law, adopted early Monday, requires all workers in the healthcare sector to start getting vaccinated by September 15th or risk suspension. It also requires a health pass to enter all restaurants, trains, planes, and some other public venues. To get the pass, people must have proof that they are fully vaccinated, recently tested negative, or recently recovered from the virus. Armed kidnappers in Nigeria have released 28 of the more than 120 students who were abducted at the beginning of July from the Bethel Baptist High School in the northern town of Damishi. The Reverend Israel Akanji said more than 80 other children are still being held by the gunmen. So far, 34 children kidnapped on July 5th have either been released or have escaped from the custody of the gunmen. It is unclear when the other children will be released. Gunmen have carried out a spat of mass abductions from schools in northern Nigeria this year, mainly seeking ransoms. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. We'll see you next time.